Peter Adamson, Heraclitus was notoriously critical of others, and he went for the greats. I mean, he lambasted Homer and Hesiod, and his near contemporary Pythagoras was brutally dismissed. What was going on there?
Yeah, he actually says Homer should be beaten with a stick and thrown out of the contests, the dramatic contests. And it's interesting because I was just suggesting
why did he consider that punishment due to Homer?
Right. Well, I think he groups in Homer along with Hesiod and some other people we think of as pre-Socratics, like Xenophanes, even though he probably agreed with him about God. And I think the criticism he makes of them, that's most dominant in the fragments, is that they are people who acquire lots of learning. And I think he associates that with the idea of sort of believing whatever you hear. So his view is that there's kind of what people usually do in order to become wise, which is just listen to the traditional teachings, which of course are very strongly associated with Homer and Hesiod. Or you can think for yourself, which is what Heraclitus says he has done and what he wants you to do. And there's another fragment actually which says that eyesight is a better witness than hearing. And it's not quite clear what that means, but I think maybe what he means is, look for yourself, don't just listen to what other people think.
There's a cutting edge, isn't it? Is it? I can't remember accurately, but is it? Does he say learning doesn't make you wise? Look at Pythagoras.
He says if lots of learning made people wise, then it would, or gave you understanding. The word is nous. Then it would have made these people wise. And he names Hesiod, Pythagoras, Xenophanes, and Hecataeus, who's a historian.
James Warren, this is a big bundle of a question, and I don't apologise. It's worth that.
Thank you.
He influenced Plato
yes.
and Aristotle and the Stoics. This is the beginning, the firm stem of Western philosophy, to which somebody said, we're all footnotes, or you lot have been all footnotes ever since. So this is a powerful influence on powerful people. Can you just give us some central notion as to why what he said was so influential on these people?
Well, the influence... Let's take Plato and the Stoics, perhaps. I think Aristotle had less time for Heraclitus than these other two. For Plato, what struck Plato about the Heraclitean insight was this idea that certainly the sorts of things you encounter in your everyday life, the sort of perceptible world, is subject to displaying these opposing properties at different times, maybe at the same time. And this worried Plato because he wanted things that you can know to be stable and not displaying this kind of intrinsic opposition. So in some moods, Plato thinks that will rule out lots of the sorts of things you might come across in everyday life as proper objects of knowledge. If you combine that with the thought that there might really be proper objects of knowledge that don't change and so on, then you're beginning to move towards a sort of Platonic notion of the forms, to contrast with this world of perception. For the Stoics, I think they took from Heraclitus, and we know Cleanthes the Stoic wrote works on Heraclitus, so they were very interested in him. They took two principal ideas, I think. First of all, this idea of, I think Angie mentioned it before, a rational principle governing the world, an active, rational, causal principle. And secondly, this notion of fire as the a kind of foundational element. And the Stoics more or less identified these two in various moods and saw a rational principle built into the very foundations of the world, guiding it along everything it does, and eventually, after so many years, returning it all to a great conflagration.
And Angie Hobbs, as I understand it, Heraclitus' influence was still powerful when we get to Hegel and Nietzsche, and it's still...
Oh yes, I mean Hegel likes the idea of opposites and apparent tensions combining to form, greater harmonies and unity, and the importance of resolution through conflict. He writes about that at the beginning of his Logic, for instance. Nietzsche's profoundly influenced. In Ecce Homo, Nietzsche says that in some ways the doctrine of Zarathustra, in Thus Spake Zarathustra, about the importance of becoming and so on, is anticipated by Heraclitus. And I think in Ecce Homo, Nietzsche also says that he feels a deep proximity to Heraclitus and that he feels warmer. I think he says he feels warmer when he's proximate to Heraclitus than to any other philosopher. And then for Heidegger again, Heidegger loves the pre-Socratics, as we call them, not as Heidegger will call them, as we'll see in a minute, particularly because for Heidegger, things go wrong in Western philosophy with Plato and Platonic metaphysics. So he wants to go back to a time, particularly the time of Heraclitus, when philosophy is, in Heidegger's view, uncontaminated by Platonic metaphysics. And he believes that Heidegger writes about the experience of being as becoming, and the experience of being as something in history, which is then messed up by Plato. So I think Heidegger would like us to get rid of the whole label pre-Socratic. Socrates is the problem, and Plato is the problem.
Can we talk about the man finally, Peter, and the death of Heraclitus? What sort of real evidence do we have for it before you tell us the story?
Oh, probably no real evidence, but the story is really good.
So we'll end with a little tale.
The tale is probably fabricated out of his thoughts and fragments. So he's said that the soul is fiery, right? So my favorite fragment is that the reason people act the way they do when they're drunk is that their souls are wet. So the story is that he acquired dropsy because he was out in the mountains eating herbs. He came into the town and said to the doctors in the town in a riddle, "Can you make a drought out of a rainstorm?" And they didn't know what he was talking about, so there's a joke about him being obscure. So he buried himself in the dung in a cow stall in order to evaporate off the water through the heat, and this didn't work, and so he died there in the cow stall. So this is obviously a kind of jokey story, making fun of his philosophical teachings and weaving that into an anecdote about his death. But it's a good anecdote. So.
Well, it is. Thank you very much. Thank you, Angie Hobbs, James Warren, and Peter Adamson. Next week we'll be talking about the Concordat of Worms in 1122, and thank you very much for listening.